Even if David Carroll were not so well loved in Chattanooga, the imaginary story I'm going to tell about him would be shocking nonetheless. David Carroll, of course, is the TV3 NBC star. He is a local man, knows everybody in Chattanooga, is on my list of top 4 journalists and public reporters, public figures in Chattanooga. The leading one, I would say, is Dave Flessner at the Times Free Press. The second one would be Judy Walton on the same staff. And David Carroll, I think I would probably have him in the third place with John Wilson at Chattanoogan.com as competing for the third spot. But for the moment, let's assume that David Carroll, who's the co-anchor on TV3 Eyewitness News, is the third leading light of the press in Chattanooga. He's been at TV3 since 1987 and does election coverage. He does the school report and is highly, highly respected. And everybody knows David Carroll. He's always fair, always just in his narrative of what is happening in Chattanooga. Now, what we want to think though about is this: what would happen if David Carroll were involved in an accident? In which the perpetrator, the man in charge of the mishap, who was responsible for it, either negligently or perhaps faultily or intentionally, brought a damage on the road to David in his car, and there is made an accusation against this man, and David is the witness. David describes his injuries and his medical expenses, and it is judged by the jury in a trial, in an inquest, right, a public hearing. It is judged by that jury that in fact the injuries to this beloved local newscaster reach $500,000 or $500,000. Now, this is in the court. Let's just say, we're just imagining now, right? Nothing's happened to David Carroll, but let's just imagine that in Judge Don Poole's court, this ruling has come down. This finding of fact by the jury, and the adjudication of this matter, as opposed to the administration of it, the adjudication of this matter brought by criminal court judge Don Poole, and the man, the defendant in the case is Philip Esterholz. Okay, we're imagining here, and that's the name of the man who negligently caused an accident. Maybe he was drinking. We'll have to just imagine what the circumstances are that brought these two men noisily with shattered glass and bent steel together on the highway. Philip Esterholz crashing into David Carroll. Again, we're just imagining this. Okay, it hasn't really happened. Now the question is, if it's a criminal matter today, we have a system in which Judge Poole might assign Philip to, let's say, 2.5 years in prison, maybe 3 years in prison, because it was extraordinary negligence, and then Philip actually left the scene of the accident. Okay, so that there's a wrong there, and if we follow our current distinctions between civil and criminal matters, which we do, for which there is a fair defense for it, this is a criminal matter, and the offended party is the state, and the remedy, right, the making right is not. It is not a restoration of David Carroll in his body and a compensation for his losses and a making up of his lost time, his lost wages, and the injury done to him, the loss of consort with his wife, for example. That could be part of the damages to David Carroll, and the loss of his profession. They have 2 sons, Chris and Vince, and Cindy. She's not available. David's not available to her in consort, and so they are damaged, both of them. Right? The whole family's been damaged to the tune of $500,000. Well, in modern jurisprudence, which comes out of the Quaker system, where we have the Quaker model of justice that had brought into America amazing contradictions. The Quaker system of justice, which helped end slavery, right? The abolitionist movement against slavery came out of the Quakers. They were the first in the Protestant world to make a stink out of what was happening, which Christians across the colonies back in the 1600s and 1700s allowed to happen, the enslaving of black people, even black people who had become Christians, right? Even those were continued in slavery, even though the law of God in the case law is very clear that there has to be freedom granted to Israelites who are enslaved, and so there was a duty of the white owners to free their black slaves after up to a certain length of time that they could keep them to pay themselves back for the loss of that person. But that law wasn't honored, so blacks were kept in perpetual slavery in the colonies, and the Quakers said no, right? They were the abolitionists. And yet the Quakers brought us another alternative to restitution, the whole restitutionary scheme, which is outlined in the Old Testament in the government policy part of the Bible. That's the Old Testament. The New Testament deals mostly with individual salvation, individual living, and dealing with oppression, dealing with temptation, and dealing with the leftovers of the old form of worship, and also paganism and its many temptations. You know, the Corinthian way of living, right, full of sexual idolatry and sexual priestesses and the like. That was all part of the temptation of the young Christian in that era. And so the New Testament deals with the individual. The Old Testament deals with the kingdom, largely, right? That's how the book is divided. So public policy, if you will, law, government courts, all established by the time Christ came. All the teaching in Christianity given over by that time. It was all kind of set in stone, though some of the ordinances passed with the passing of the state of Israel and the arrival of the church. But many of the rules of equity and the law that governs a city, governs a county, a state, those laws are still in effect, as the Ten Commandments are still in effect. So here we have David Carroll. And in our modern system, the perpetrator, Philip Esterholz, is required to pay $500,000 in damages. But in our system today, there is no such finding made in criminal court. It's just that did he violate the law, and was this person injured, and what does the jury find? Well, they find him guilty, and then Philip goes to jail. And in the jail, it is said that he is he's serving his time. He's paying a debt to society. And if you think about that under the Quaker humanistic system, where there is the idea of the penitentiary, where you make penance, right? You separate yourself from your former friends and evil companions, and you now think about your crimes, and you resolve to be a better man, resolve not to do them again. Maybe find God in the prison, right, as you're making penitence. And then when you come back out, you're a better man, and you've been healed, right? You've been healed by the state. And that is the system we have today. It is entirely humanistic, and it's anti-God. It's anti-God, and it's anti-local economy. Both being wrong, right? Both are wrong. And this is David Tulis, 92.7 FM and 95.3 HD for high definition, mega powerful digital radio. In fact, that's the fact we have a signal that's high definition on channel 4 that reaches so far that adds to the temperature increase of my microphone by 15 or 20%. The fact that I'm out there on digital makes my microphone heat up 15 or 20% more. It's so hot that at the end of my show, Russell Stroud, the news director, has to put ice packs on the mic to cool it off because it's smoke. Sometimes it actually smokes like an overheated barrel of an M4 carbine, right? So here's David Carroll. Okay, let's get back to the story. David Carroll, injured by Philip Esterholz and a $500,000. What would happen biblically if you didn't have prisons? Now, I bring this up because we learned this week that, I'm learning late about the Demetria Kelly-Demos story out of Nashville and the state audit of prisons. And 2 Democratic legislators are proposing that the Department of Correction be shut down, that it be sunsetted, right? It be sunsetted and abolished when its time expires in midsummer of 2018. Very worthy idea. But let's see if we can give a positive ethic for the ending of this system of slavery, state slavery, the state prison system, because the state prison system does not bring justice to David Carroll, who's been injured by the reckless and careless negligence, if that's not redundant, of Philip Esterholz in a car accident. Now, if the biblical model were to be imposed, if Judge Poole would say, I'm going to make sure that I care about victims' rights first. In fact, our law, our Constitution, at the very, very end of the Bill of Rights has all the provisions, and you have, if you're involved in a criminal matter, you have a right to restitution. have you ever thought about seeking restitution? It's Section 35, Part G. You have, as a victim, the right to restitution from the offender, period. Okay, that's your right, a right to restitution from the offender. But that is not enforced, and Judge Poole in criminal court does not enforce it. And there's no care for it. There's absolutely no care for it. The state, once the state gets the prisoner, all is satisfied. There is a catharsis of satisfaction in the state. We have our man. We are now satisfied. We are satisfied, and we have him in prison, which is a hellhole, right? Prisons are living hells. God has a hell for sinners, and men who disbelieve in God's hell and God's heaven will create instead an Elysium of Social Security welfare on one hand and a hell on the other for the wrongdoer, and that is the prison. What would David Carroll's life be like if he had a claim upon Philip Esterholtz, the man who injured him? How would that actually work? How would there be what the Bible prescribes as an indentured servitude? If the thief doesn't have money to pay, he shall be sold for his theft. The principle is that the sale of the perpetrator is to make restitution. Okay, because the Bible, Christendom, right, Christianity, right, is totally victims' rights oriented. It's all about the victim's rights if there's a wrong done. And as Gary North points out in his magnificent, one of he has several opuses. Perhaps the most magnificent one is Tools of Dominion, which is one of my biggest books. It's one of my biggest law books, and it is a serious study on the laws of God and how they actually work. And the view in the scriptures, the view that Christian ministers should be teaching about on Sunday, is they pursue restoration of the country and make note of the evangelical purposes of the law. Right, the law has an evangelistic purpose. It has a purpose of bringing into people's minds and into people's lives the claims of God and justice. There is in the biblical system an interest in rehabilitation. So how would David Carroll be restored, and how would that connection in a kind of personal slavery, an indentured servitude, how would that benefit Philip Esterholtz, who caused the accident? Well, here's what the Carroll family would have to do. So here's a man whose skills are not the same skill set as David, but David is going to determine to make this man useful in his business, which is anchoring a TV newscast and being a reporter. So what would have to happen is this: that the victim, who's now retaining restitution, would find a way to make this person useful. So it would be that David would have now an assistant, right? This man would always be there assisting David, getting his things done. So he would be a gopher. He would do chores. He would learn something of what David did in his calling. He might be the chauffeur of him as so David's in the passenger seat getting ready for an interview, and Philip is of course he's now wearing a tie and a nice jacket, and he's learning his grammar. He is handling the car. And also the Carroll's old grandmother, right? The children's old grandmother. Philip is as needed. He is the sitter for the old woman who's in another part of town. He also does the mowing of the lawn. He will do the pressure washing on the very grayed areas, parts of the Carroll home that need pressure washing. He will do some saw work. And probably while he's doing these things, he's recording the work he's doing and putting a dollar value on them, right? Because he's got a long way to go to make $500,000. And as he's helping David and trying to be useful to him and looking out for him, and eventually he's going to be learning to make phone calls on behalf of David. He's learning to line up guests. He'll be doing other things to make David more fruitful and more profitable. Notice what's happening here. This is local economy, right? The biblical system of justice is not an alien, bureaucratic, and solitudinary sort of existence. There is a relationship between the victim who's receiving his goods back and the perpetrator. There is an evangelistic purpose here. The victim, David, is giving benefits in the way of knowledge and insight to this man who could never otherwise have had a connection with David Carroll, but now he has one because David Carroll wants to get his money back, right? Not that David Carroll's a Shylock, not the Jewish character in the Shakespeare play who wants his pound of flesh, but David Carroll is getting his due from the man who injured him, right? And so while David is still healing, Philip Esterholz, the indentured servant, is there making everything work for him. So that would be doing the oil changes, because maybe David likes to do his own oil, and other things that are needful to that family and that individual. And what's happening, though, notice, is that here's a man who's getting a blessing from his superior. David Carroll is superior to most people in Chattanooga as a Christian man, as a fine character and a good man. And that here we have a commoner, right? A commoner who is careless. Now this commoner is suddenly being elevated in his station because he is connected with David Carroll. Philip Esterholz belongs to David Carroll in a way through this arrangement overseen by the court, Judge Don Poole. But David Carroll belongs to him. Do you see what's happening? You have a personal relationship here that you don't have in the current system. In the current system, Philip Esterholz would be in prison, and David Carroll would have forgotten about him. But now, because there's a personal payment that has to be made, because the system of justice is truly victims' rights oriented and truly just, right? Because the jury agreed that the damage was $500,000, and Philip owes $500,000. And now, since we believe in godly justice, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, limb for limb, eye for eye, stroke for stroke, that's called lex talionis. Because we believe in lex talionis, we believe that God is just, and he doesn't require over punishment, and he forbids under punishment. He requires equal treatment, right? Equality. That's what biblical justice is about. David Carroll is now bringing a benefit to his servant, his slave, if you will, a private slave. Now, this isn't possible because we have a ban in the Constitution on private servitudes and private slavery. Chattel slavery is outlawed, even though in the same breath, in actually the next breath, in the Bill of Rights, Section 33 and 34, slavery and involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, are forever prohibited. So theoretically, I'd say it'd be constitutional to have a private servitude of David Carroll by Philip Esterholz, the man who damaged him in the car accident, because it is for a crime for which Esterholz was duly convicted. The next sentence, by the way, says that the General Assembly shall make no law recognizing the right of property of man. So you could say that just as the law in Tennessee recognizes that we have, you, my listener, don't have a property interest in your wife directly, okay? You have a property interest in her generally, but not in the chattel sense, or not in the slavery property sense. You have a property interest in her relationship, okay? That's called a consortium, as I mentioned earlier. You have and that's in the Tennessee Code. Actually, it's a Tennessee decision, 1870, I think, that you don't have, because of the ban on slavery, you don't have a property right in your wife, but in her relationship, right? In making love to her, that is a property right. You have a property right to make love to your wife, and she with you, right? So you're both damaged if there's some physical damage to you or to her that prevent that from happening. But here now, in the case with David Carroll and Philip Esterholz, there is a property right, and there's a dollar figure attached to it, and David's going to collect. But notice what happens, because it's a personal servitude and a personal restitution. Guess what? The sweetness and goodness of David Carroll will make itself felt at some point, because this relationship is personal. David will say, "Philip, you have served me for a year, and there's no way you can pay me back. There's just no way I can wring from you in the services you're giving to me and my family $500,000. You would have to be with me until you were 65. And here you are, you're just 29. You would have to be with me forever. And I don't want to encumber you. I forgive you. You may go. You may go now and lead your own life. I think you've learned from me, and I've learned from you. And because you have made the effort and in good faith sought to restore my damages, I'm going to overlook the losses that I've suffered, and I'm going to overlook the injuries that you caused me. And I'm going to free you from this bondage, because you are, in fact, you have become a Christian, and you have your own calling and have your own life, and you've met this nice girl, and I don't want to bind you any further." So that's what would happen. David Carroll would forgive him, not having been paid but $10,000 or maybe $20,000 worth of services from this man who damaged him in the car accident. And because the biblical model is a local economy, loco-centric perspective, has that perspective. The victim is gratified. The victim is restored. There is no prison, and there is no cost to David Carroll. You see, in the current system, David Carroll has to pay twice, right? He pays for his injury, and then he has to pay again as a taxpayer to pay for the prison in which a living hell in which a living hell, Philip Esterholz would be confined for 3 years in a criminal sentence by Judge Poole. That doesn't happen. There is no sentence to prison. There is no prison. That is the biblical model. That is penal reform. That is biblical equity. And that's just local economy. That is local economy. And let me ask you, why are we not hearing about this from the local churches? Why does your minister, if you're a Christian, why has he never even touched this topic? It's a great topic, and it's right there in the Bible. The Bible is full of this kind of material. It's just absolutely chock full of equity, fairness, and justice, and get this, local economy, a local personal connection between the victim and the perpetrator for the restoration and improvement of both. David Tulis.
The Tennessee Valley's news talk leader, Nooga Radio,